We are excited to be with you. My name is Allison, and I am the Chief Learning Officer at Idealis. And I'm so happy today to have both Simona DeGraff, the founder and CEO of Idealis, as well as John Dick, the CEO and founder of CivicScience, with me today to talk about parenting in the workplace. So, Simona, John, I want you to be able to say hi before we get started.
Hey, it's great to be here, especially when the world is so calm and normal as it is right now. This is a nice little respite.
Agreed. It's always nice to spend time talking about the state of the world on a webinar instead of having to actually live in it for just a couple of minutes. So thanks everyone for joining the conversation. Excited to be here.
Well, why don't we jump right in? I want to make sure we have time to really talk about a very packed topic. But John, do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the world through the lens of CivicScience right now?
Yeah, sort of, independent of, but highly relevant to today's conversation. Of course, we're paying very close attention to kind of macro consumer sentiment right now. And look, it's not great. All of the main indices that we track, consumer financial health, economic sentiment, emotional well-being index, which is, I think, particularly relevant to today's topic, are all in a pretty significant sustained period of decline. Frankly, to degrees we've never seen in our data. And some of those indices go all the way back to 2012, 13. The consumer is feeling tremendous amount of anxiety, uncertainty that's breeding just a broader sense of fear that's manifesting itself in how they operate at work, how they spend their money, how they're operating at home. And it's really important, I think context or subtext for what we're talking about today, right? Everything that one of our kind of taglines here is that everything affects everything. So all the stuff going on in the world we're bringing that to work, whether it's conscious or not. The other part of that is that everything's constantly changing. So we have to keep a really close eye on all of these. We're going to even share some slides today and talk about trends that we expect to change in the coming months and years. So there's a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty and fear. It's affecting different groups of people in different ways. That will be another big theme we talk about today. But again, probably no surprise to everyone with all that's going on in the world and government and politics and the economy that the consumer's kind of on edge at the moment.
And Simona, with what John has just shared, can you overlay a little bit of a zoom in on why parents right now?
Yeah, so part of what I love about our partnership, John, is you talk about what consumers are feeling, and what we know is consumers are also parents. They're not parents. We're also sort of who we are at work, at home, even though sometimes we monitor ourselves a little better in the workplace. And so we got really interested to understand, knowing all of that uncertainty that exists, we're always questioning and trying to understand, how does that impact people at work? And that's part of the work that we do with you guys on Pulse. But what we try to bring to this audience and through our reports is, what are some of the trends that are affecting workers in the workplace? And what are some of the attributes of workers that we ought to understand so that we can sort of figure out how to create better workplaces for people and make sure that people are productive? And so when we started thinking about why focusing on parents at work, what we know is that a very large percentage of the people who are currently in the labor workforce are parents. And we know, based on the data, that 4 out of 10 US workers are parents of children under the age of 18. So they are caregivers of children. That doesn't count how many are also caregivers of elderly parents and elderly family members. And so caregiving is something we're seeing as a real opportunity to dig into, and it's relevant across all companies, because if you look at your workforce, you likely have people who identify as parents and have responsibilities. We're also seeing broadly that there is a pretty significant crisis associated with parents that others are seeing that we want to tap into. So number one, in 2024, we saw that the US Surgeon General highlighted that there's a national parental health crisis, and that the mental health of parents was at significant risk because of all of the challenges that parents are faced with today. In 2024, the election in the US, we saw that family leave and childcare was a ticket item. People were talking about it, people were debating on it. And it was something that was coming across both parties, which we don't often see topics that both parties agree upon nowadays, but that was certainly one that was being brought up on both sides. And then the last thing that just recently happened, and I had to refresh and check to see if this was like being punked, was that the White House declared that they needed more women to have more babies. And so, I think this is really interesting, especially, John, as we talk about the demographics of the workforce, how things may change. Are people going to have more children? Are we seeing people have less children? What we're seeing right now is population growth is a risk, and that women are choosing to have less children. And that those are family decisions, those are individual decisions. But this notion of incentivizing people without really understanding the experience of women at work was something we got really curious about. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Well, there's certainly some large secular trends underlying a lot of this, right? I mean, there's a kind of, the crisis of young men you're hearing a lot of people talk about and researchers write about. We're seeing significantly disproportionate numbers of relative numbers of women applying to four-year colleges relative to men. I think even the slide before this that just showed the ratio of working moms and working dads in the workforce, there's reason to believe that ratio is going to change. Again, something we're going to keep a very close eye on. If fewer and fewer young men are going into four-year colleges and then presumably graduate school, then that's going to be a much smaller population of men going into kind of the educated workforce, which could both create more opportunity for women, but also probably more challenges for them, and maybe even greater deterrence from having children, because the expectation will be then that more and more women are the breadwinners in their families at that point. So there's not a lot in the secular trends to suggest these problems are going to get better. The population decline problem and the children problem. I know the president's talking about wanting to have some sort of new baby boom in his administration, but there don't seem to be any policies yet being enacted to facilitate that. So definitely something we want to keep an eye on as a larger secular trend going forward.
For sure.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in then and hear what a whole lot of U.S. workers have to say. Simona, really quickly, do you want to just touch on how parents show up in our sample this quarter?
Yeah. So if those of you who are returning and those of you who are new, I'll share a really high level. Our partnership with CivicScience allows us to look at a lot of people and a lot of data. And so, and it represents the current demographics of the U.S. workforce. So we balance the data based on what the current BLS consists of. And so the current sample you're going to hear about the data from is almost 50-50 split men and women, people who identify as female and identify as male, and our parents. We also represent a handful of non-parents, also split relatively evenly between female and male. We represent families that look different from one another, people who have different identities. So a large percentage of our sample identifies as heterosexual, a smaller percentage, but still important in terms of the representation in our data, identify as LGBTQ+. If we go to the next slide, we represent all the different demographics that currently exist in your workforce. So ages, people who earn more than $100,000, less than $100,000 annually, all of the different races and ethnicities that are represented. And then this one's interesting, we'll dig into a little bit, but education levels. So people who have no college degree, going back to John's point, people who are college degrees, and people who have higher level degrees. And we look at the differences in all of these experiences in all of our data.
Great.
So hopefully you see yourself in our information. Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Well, as we get started, I just want to orient people a little bit. You all have the ability to throw a question out to John and Simona, and we will try and answer as many of those kind of in flow as we can. So use the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to submit a question. You can also chat with one another. And then also, I just want to note that there are a couple things that you can download today. One of those is the slide presentation, but what I'm hearing is that it's not downloading at the moment. So we're going to keep playing with it. And if it's not, it will come to you in the email follow-up that comes after the webinar. So with that, Simona and John, I think the first question that we want to tackle is this idea of balance. Is it unique to parents, or is this what we're seeing about across everybody right now?
I'm
I think it's about as universal as it gets.
Yes, that's exactly right. And as three parents on the line here with different families and a different number of kids at different life stages, I think we would all say it's as universal as it gets. Allison jumped over the 100,000 workers here, but it's a pretty significant sample that we looked at here that represents the people who are currently in the workforce. And one of the biggest samples in a report that I've seen as a former CHRO. And so, John, what I want to dig into here with you is the universal need data. If we go to the slide, what we're seeing between parents and non-parents is it's not all that different, that people don't feel like they have adequate time. So a third of the workforce effectively doesn't feel like they have adequate time to fulfill their responsibilities outside of work. And if we go to the next slide, they're not feeling that differently, whether they're in person or remote, but those who are hybrid workers are actually feeling the weight of the balance the most. But what's your take on that? Because that's where I get really interested, and I, of course, have a lot of ideas on this.
Well, I think I was frankly surprised to see this when the data came out, or at least I thought it was very thought-provoking, that sort of the nature of hybrid sort of insinuates that there's a balance, and kind of literally speaking, I'm spending half of my time in an office and half of my time at home, and you'd think that would be more prone to a balanced lifestyle. And what we're seeing is the opposite here, that one interpretation could be that having to sort of bounce between one place and the other creates its own sense of stress and chaos. And I'm maybe not feeling as settled at one place or the other as if I would sort of was only at home or only at work. I've got, different setups in my two different places. I've got, when I finally get back into, say, the office, I maybe want to spend a little bit more time socializing because I'm connecting with people. But when I'm at home, I'm dealing with people coming to my door, and my dog's running around my house, and I don't kind of get into the same routine that I might if I was just in one place or the other. There's probably a lot of reasons to explain this, but I found it interesting when we saw the stats for the first time.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think I was shocked when we didn't see that big of a difference between parents on balancing it all, parents and non-parents. And I think what we learned from that is balance means different things to different people. And what you're balancing may be different. And while parents are balancing childcare and responsibilities for children, in addition to other things, non-parents are also balancing a lot of responsibilities outside of work. So there is this sort of universal calling. And whereas there's an assumption that how you work and where you work may help, this data is suggesting having that level of flexibility, the hybrid, doesn't actually help you have the amount of time you need to fulfill your responsibilities out of work. There's something else that people are looking for. And I was a bit shocked at this. However, as somebody who does work remote but kind of hybrid, because I have an office I can go to, what our teams helped us think through was this notion of being predictable in how you work. If you feel like on one day your boss is calling you in and the next day you can work from home, but then you're getting phone calls at night because you're trying to balance it all, and it's not as easy than saying I work from 9 to 5 on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Friday in an office, and when I come home, I'm not working anymore, which doesn't apply to most people who are white collar workers anymore, but for sure applies to a large sample of people in our report.
Awesome.
There's also multiple flavors of hybrid. In terms of, are they days that I'm required to be in the office versus home, which makes it really difficult to get into a routine. So I have to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but I've got a certain arrangement set up for my kids on Mondays and Fridays, as opposed to in our situation, we have an office that is entirely voluntary for people to attend whenever they want, no requirement that they do. And at least in my case, I know going into having the opportunity to go into the office does give me balance, because sometimes I do it just because I need a different place to work for a day, right? I need to be out of my house or so there's so many different flavors of hybrid. We didn't really dig much further into it than that, but it probably depends a lot on sort of what the rules are and obligations are.
Totally.
So true.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited about this next one because it was the piece of data or the couple pieces of data that really surprised me a little bit. So, Simona, you want to start by talking a little bit about how are parents balancing right now based on what we just learned?
Yeah, look, this one, same thing. We have Abby on our team of data scientists. We're like, wait a second, let's go through this together one more time. So what we found in the data here was that parents on balance are having a more positive experience at work than their non-parent colleagues. And that's across the board. So if you see 1 point something X, you're effectively seeing that their experiences are better than by a magnitude. And you can sort of break down each section. So one, we're seeing parents are happier in their jobs. They tend to find work that's more meaningful to them personally. They are able to focus on skill development, so they're finding work to be sort of professionally fulfilling. They tend to be more engaged in their work. We're seeing parents tend to have more positive workplace relationships. They feel more cared for by their managers. They tend to have friends and colleagues who they see as friends at work. They often at work feel more comfortable expressing themselves to their colleagues. And then finally, this one was the most interesting for me, that parents are on average more trusting of their companies. So they tend to feel a higher sense of belonging within their workplace. They tend to feel like companies have a role to play and that they feel like that role is more positive in the world of work. And they tend to be more trusting of their top bosses and their CEOs. So there's this parenting lift that, that identity is creating in the workplace. And we got really fascinated by that. John, what's your take?
Well, there's one thing that's hard to tease out of these data sometimes is that there's a bit of an age, those non-parents are going to skew younger on average. So we know, for example, that there are lower levels of institutional trust among today's kind of Gen Z adults, just full stop, maybe independent of whether they're parents or not. So that some of that kind of shows through here. But also too, those younger, we've got an entire generation of, like, even in our company, of young people who've stepped into the workplace, maybe in 20, 21, 22, 23, and their first couple years of their job lives were remote by necessity. And that now they're being asked to come back into the office without, maybe they were kind of spoiled a little bit by the flexibility that sort of early remote life gave them. Whereas those of us who maybe had spent years or a decade or more in the workforce prior to COVID knew the good things about it, knew the support that it provided us, the relationships that we were able to build, how it made us better at our jobs in some ways. And so I think a lot of us maybe who are getting back to something closer to a normal kind of pre-COVID type of work life are appreciating it a little bit more now that we knew what it was like to not have it. So there, again, lots of things to try to tease out from these data, but those are maybe some of the influences that come through to it. And when I think about it from my own personal perspective.
For sure. But I have this theory that those who are ages 30 to 50 will be coined the greatest generation of our time. And I think it's because we're perhaps, and we can look at the data, John, and maybe this becomes a quarterly report at some point of like the new greatest generation. And I think it's inclusive of all three of us. So let's go there for a second. But this idea that folks who have lived a life professionally pre-COVID and post-COVID, folks who have seen a world with AI, without AI, folks, there's like this sort of perspective that this group has that's quite distinctive. And we happen to be in the thick of child rearing. So we're seeing the world shift and are having to navigate it in hyper speed in order to manage. I think what we're seeing here is that work is a buffer for people. That as parents who are navigating all the uncertainty you were describing, that Allison, we talk about a lot, being a parent and being in a workplace, the workplace creates a sense of stability and centered experience for people. Our monthly data, which we produce with you all, it's a monthly report, is showing that there are more workplace connections happening today than there have been in the past. And it's this idea that you're creating a bubble around you of people who can be certainly certain about the things you can be certain about. And so if you can have that at work, it does create a buffer around some of the difficult things we're navigating more broadly in a macro context. And I think parents are seeing the workplace as a source of that more so, and maybe from a survival perspective, because they need it for it to stay stable while they're navigating being the center of, the center of gravity for their homes and perhaps their workplaces.
And I don't have the scientific.
Well, your theory about the greatest generation is an interesting one. I think a very plausible one. You're right, and I'd like to think so as a member of that generation that we're great.
Yeah.
But you touched on, I think, something that's really important about the kind of commiseration we get to do at work, because we're with a lot of people in that environment. They're all kind of going through the same things, and whether it's an opportunity to go out to lunch or for coffee, or even just the first 5 or 10 minutes of a Zoom meeting. Those connections that we don't really get. There aren't many other places in life that we get that, other than maybe the relationships we have with our kids, friends, parents at parties and sporting events and the like. But work is sort of the essential, if not only, place that we can really commiserate with other people that are going through what we're going through. And back to my comments about the current macro environment at the beginning, it's ever more important. That's why we're seeing those numbers go up, right? The global kind of macro stress all of us are facing is dialed up to 11 right now, and work is one place where we can kind of again commiserate with people about that, and it's especially essential right this minute.
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't have the data points behind it, but I think we would all say, we hear parents often say it's hard to find parent friends. Right? It's really hard to make friends in the busyness of our parenting lives. And so there may be something here to what you're saying, John, in terms of, these are people you see every day. They see you at a really high, they see you at a low, and kind of everything in between. And so you start to feel more comfortable sharing with them and commiserating with them than you do when you're at the baseball field and then you're running over to your other, kid to get them from daycare. So there may be something on that. So Simona, let's move to this next question. Are all parents having a similar experience?
So this goes back to our sample, and Allison, I appreciate you asking this question. Part of why we share this is because sometimes we make assumptions because it's shortcutting lots of complexity, right? So when we make comments like parents versus non-parents, we're sort of putting a bunch of people together into two very clear boxes. But if we actually break it down, and we start to look at parents specifically and the different demographics that we measure. In this case, we looked at parents with or without higher degrees. So this is folks who are college educated or more. So the blue line would be parents without degrees. The orange line is parents with degrees. But we found that with parents who have less formal education tend to be more negative towards work as compared with those who have higher level degrees. And what we pulled out were the places where we saw the greatest difference. They tend to feel, and we do see this effect if you look at our monthly report, we do tend to see differences in how people experience in the workplace based on their education level. That often correlates with the type of job that people have. But we're seeing organizations, many of our clients are no longer requiring formal degrees for jobs. They've taken that requirement off the table. And so we're going to continue to see this trend more and more with people who don't have formal education, maybe moving into roles that are of more significant influence or in bigger sort of pockets. Here, what we saw is a pretty significant difference on things like their trust in the CEO, the extent to which they feel supported by their coworker, and those who feel like their manager cares about them as a person. So there's a gap in parents who have formal degrees and for people who don't have degrees formally in some of these pretty significant drivers of employee engagement and employee experience. And I think this is an interesting one because if we, as a former CHRO, if I looked at my workforce and said, how many of my people that we employ have formal degrees, and are they having a different experience than those who don't? It's a different cut of the data that could be really helpful and interesting to look at, particularly as it relates to some of these topics. Do they trust the company? Do they feel supported, et cetera? But the parent lens just adds a different dimension to that. If we go to the next slide, the other thing we saw in the data is that the extent to which people are earning more than $75,000 in their household also dictates the experience that parents are having at work. And so what we found was if we look at low income parents, less than 75K, mid income is 75 to 150, and high income is 150 or more, again, that's household, we're seeing that parents in the workforce who make less money are expressing far greater concern about their jobs and their employment situation. Again, going back to John, what you said, that's a case across the board. Our job concern data with you all that we run every single day across thousands of people are worried about their employment situation. But in particular, those who are really worried tend to be caregivers of people under 18, and they tend to make less than $75,000 a year. And so again, as an employer, there is a question mark on, are we thinking about the long-term effects on people's lives and livelihoods if they're earning less money than what would be livable wage in many places in the US? And are we addressing those needs in any particular way? So interesting data for us. What's your take?
Well, I mean, you nailed it. I will just go back to something you said about one of the, we say this to our clients all the time, regardless of what we're studying, is to be one of the biggest dangers in looking at data is to see a single line on a chart and think that it's definitive when we realize every line on a chart is an average of thousands and thousands of other lines that make it up, right? And so a lot of people in leadership and decision-making positions in business want that one-size-fits-all answer based on that one line they see on a chart going up and to the right or down and to the right. And we've got to dig so much deeper into those numbers to really understand, because it's going to vary so much by who is your workforce. Not just are they making or how educated are they, but geographically where you're based. You know, we know right now political sensitivities weigh a lot on people's views of the job market and the economy. And so people in red areas are going to feel differently about work than people in blue areas. It is just, and unfortunately for people looking for easy one-size-fits-all answers for these things, there aren't any. It is a very, very complex cocktail of demographics and psychographics and geography. You know, income's an easy one to get our head around, right? Because people who are making less money have less childcare options, and they're going to have more stress because maybe they're trying to shuttle their children to their grandparents one day and to daycare the next, right? So this one makes a lot of sense and somewhat obvious, but there's just so much nuance to this. Depending on who's joining us today, what's the composition of their workforce is really going to kind of vary by business by business by business.
Hey, John, that's what we see in our advisory work too, right? It's like you can see the data, but now let's make it specific to you and what's happening in your context. I mean, if you've got a lot of frontline workers, on average, if their wages are less than 75,000, looking at the household level, are you the sole income earner or the breadwinner? Or do you have other sort of sources of income? Organizations sometimes miss that lens, and that because they can't see it. And so that's where it comes down to leadership, people having conversations with folks. What's interesting in terms of the certainty, if we go to the next slide, we did ask the question in our data on what percentage of your income do you currently spend on childcare? And with childcare and childcare services being a ticket item, right, we were interested in this to see. Now, the US government would say people should spend about 7 to 8% of their household income on childcare. And that's like on average, sort of recommended. If we look at this data, while we have people who are spending less than 10% on childcare, there are a lot of people who are spending way more than that. And actually the burden of cost of childcare is much higher for those who are making under $100,000 a year versus more than $100,000 a year. So we have a broader crisis here that organizations sometimes provide support for, but sometimes don't, on helping people manage it all, not balance it all, but manage it all, given the fact that there's a higher cost in raising children today than ever before, and there aren't a lot of opportunities to find the support that you may need. And so this was interesting to me because on average, people are spending far more than what they should be, quote unquote, spending on childcare. And that's likely causing some of these feelings if I'm not getting the support that I need, either in the workplace or in the world.
John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory to me. I mean, it's a big burden on parents at every, and it's also, there's childcare, but there's also saving for college. There's and I think those numbers kind of encompass quite a bit of that. It's just sort of not just the cost of having my child taken care of while I'm at work, which is kind of the more traditional definition of childcare, but literally the costs of caring for a child, feeding them, clothing them, saving for school, all those kinds of things. It is a significantly larger burden on U.S. families than it was even a decade ago.
I mean, and I just pulled up, John, yeah. Oh, I was just saying, I pulled up your economic sentiment graph here too, John. And I think zooming out into the context that you're seeing broadly, you're seeing across your economic sentiment that it's dropping pretty rapidly over the past bit of time.
Yeah, right. Look at the right side of that chart. It's the steepest decline. Now we're only going back to 2020 here, and it's a little bit kind of the same kind of decline we saw in the first couple of months of COVID, but it's now officially more sustained than that decline. It is interesting though. We've written a lot about this through context of consumer spending and lots of other things over the last few months. Is how eerily similar what's going on in the country right now feels to those early days of COVID. The uncertainty, we're even, one of the questions we ask people is about their desire to leave the house. People's desire to leave the house has declined over the last 60 days, which of course was a big, maybe the ultimate sort of COVID trend. There's, obviously it's a very different circumstance right now. It's much more of kind of economic uncertainty and maybe a bit of socio-political uncertainty as opposed to like public health uncertainty. But it's just really a reminder of how profoundly uncertainty and fear changes the way people think and behave. And yeah, we're just in a kind of a bleak stretch of it at the moment.
And I want to move us to talking about mothers versus fathers. But Simona, we did get a comment in the chat that I wanted you all to have a second to weigh in on. Someone had said a few minutes ago, this actually makes me more concerned for non-parents, knowing that the birth rates are declining. People are waiting till later to have children. There's a large number of non-parents who are 30, 40 plus. And so we don't want to explain that away just by there's a Gen Z mistrust in corporations or the workforce post-COVID, but that we might need to do some digging in on that because it's raising concerns, as you see the parent data about our non-parent folks.
Yeah, I think the number of research questions that come out of each of these that we're like, oh, we should look at that. Oh, we should look at that, which is why we keep looking at things, right? It's an interesting point because one of the things we spoke about in an event last week was there is a burden that non-parents often feel and have to carry for their parent colleagues. So, are we studying the experience of non-parents who are like, well, I don't have a kid at home, so I guess I can stay late. And is that okay? And that's where we would say, as an organization, this is where your company culture and the kinds of relationships and the way in which you think about sort of valuing your employees' time and energy and work that they do comes in almost to like supersede this idea of my identity as a parent or non-parent. What's normal in our organization? Is it okay to work late? Is it okay to ask people to stay later or to compensate for one another? Is there an element of trust and coworker support? And I think if we look at non-parents and the experiences that they're having, there likely is a difference there on the extent to which they feel like they have to lean in because they don't have this reason. But what we're also seeing is just because you're a non-parent doesn't mean you're not a caregiver, right? People have heard me say this a couple of times. Our parents are living longer and with more chronic conditions than ever before. And our children are growing up faster. And if you're an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor, you're probably experiencing that too, right? So just to say that I don't have primary responsibility for a child's life doesn't mean that you don't have some responsibility for someone's life. And so non-parent and parent alone might actually not capture that as a broader element of caregiving in general.
That was a great comment and observation. And I'm kind of kicking myself. I hadn't thought about it through this lens before because this presentation it's obviously focused on the parenting side of it, but there's two sides of this coin, right? There's that mirror image of Simona, maybe sometime in the future we'll do a separate webinar on non-parents in the workplace. Because and it speaks back to like there's no one size fits all way to run a company and run your policies in the company. That these groups of people need different levels of support and different services and different ways of thinking and different types of motivation. But right, and putting aside the secular risk of those non-parents in the workforce saying, well, I'm already having difficult time balancing my life, so why would I ever have kids? Like, is it actually going to accelerate that population decline problem if we don't solve it? Not to suggest that, companies may take it on themselves to solve the population decline problem, but we all would suffer from it. But yeah, it's kind of a mirror image a bit of all the parent data that we're sharing today.
Look, the
Yeah.
number of clients we have who talk about their pipeline of talent, I mean, this is a macro talent pipeline problem, right? If we see a population decline, we're already struggling to staff frontline jobs. Like, this is not going to go away, especially if industry continues to change. Now, some might argue AI is going to take over a lot of the jobs that we otherwise would have needed humans for. So maybe that's going to be okay. We'll dig into that in our next quarterly report. But there is certainly a topic here to explore on how this is going to impact the workforce in a more macro way. And I would make the argument, if you look at the 18 to 24-year-olds today, they're having a very different experience, and they're entering the workforce 18 years from now. I think all bets are off.
So we have a couple more questions we want to answer in the last few minutes. And the first of those is, Simona, do you want to talk briefly about what we saw and the difference between mothers and fathers?
Yes. And look, I've been doing this work probably for 20 plus years, and did a project on working mothers when I was on Wall Street. And this is sad and true and the same as what we've seen in the past. Working mothers certainly tend to have to make more career compromises compared to working fathers and women who are not parents. That has been a consistent theme that I've seen over the course of 20 years. That said, what's interesting is how many things have changed and the fact that this has not changed, right? We're seeing fathers play bigger roles in their household. We're seeing more dual learning couples in the workforce. We're seeing companies try all these new programs and policies and support mechanisms. And yet we continue to see in our data that parents who identify as women tend to find themselves making more career compromises. We also see that the perspectives of working mothers tend to be different than working fathers. So for example, moms tend to be a little bit more skeptical of people in leadership, particularly their CEOs. And so while we're seeing that level of trust in general in CEOs tend to be low, working mothers tend to be much lower than the average when it comes to trusting the person in the top job. And so this level of skepticism and maybe some hesitance, maybe playing into decisions to ramp off or ramp on, but certainly is something that we're seeing in the population of women who are mothers in the workforce.
It's not the only answer to this, but one of the things contributing to the CEO trust is the extent to which CEOs are disproportionately male to begin with. So that's absolutely going to weigh on those numbers. And on the prior slide, the disparity and sort of balance between working moms and working dads, you're right, has been, it's sort of a tale as old as time. It's another thing that if you look at the macro trends, doesn't suggest it's going to get better. If more women are going to college, more women are graduating from college, more women are taking on the breadwinning roles in their households, unless there are significant sort of parallel shifts in family caregiving dynamics between men and women, these things are only going to get worse.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
So, and then lastly, I think we want to talk for a minute about how parenting and leadership overlap. So parents who are in leader roles, tell us about that.
Oh, this is one of my favorites. So the number of people we coach, or that I even personally feel my role as a parent and my role as a leader don't vary all that much. I mean, Allison, the number of times you and I talk about, like, all right, guys, we're one team. What's the goal today, right? It's the same kind of language and tone that I take at work as we do at home. And what we saw in the data is that parent leaders, so that would be someone who identifies as a parent of a child under the age of 18 and someone who cites that they are a leader of people at work. We tend to see the same lift. They're more likely to trust their CEO relative to parents who are non-leaders. They tend to understand how decisions are made more than others. They tend to feel more cared for by their managers. They tend to admire their leaders more. They are more engaged with their work. They tend to be happier in their jobs. They tend to have more meaning. So there's this boost that we're seeing in parents who are leaders at work and the experience that they're having relative to parents who are non-leaders. And my theory behind that is it is a skill building opportunity to be a parent, and you can learn a lot of leadership skills at home. And then it's a skill building opportunity at work, because if you can figure out some of the ways that you can motivate a team of people, you can apply that in the household as well. And so I think the case for leadership development is, if you want to build great leaders today and leaders of the future, invest in your leaders, because those parents can gain the skills in both places. And actually, we're seeing them tend to have a better experience at work.
if I just think about all the lessons I've learned in things like conflict resolution and organization at home that I've brought back to work, you know, it is a exercise in leadership every day.
For sure. For sure.
Well, as we wrap up, I'd love to hear from the two of you, just your reflections after being steeped in this data. What should people be doing about this? You know, from your operator kind of lens, what should companies be thinking about? What should managers be thinking about? What should all of us be considering? Simona?
I mean, I don't know if there's a punchline takeaway, except it depends, right? Like understanding your workforce a little bit better and recognizing that they exist in a macro context, and taking the time to engage both with your own data, looking at data like this, and looking at what's real and what's true right now is something that I think a lot of companies wait for someone to do for them, or do in an episodic way, like, oh, we do it once a year, we do. But these challenges change on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And so as we're seeing the economy change, really thinking about how is that affecting different demographics in my workplace, and particularly parents. We knew that during COVID, parents were struggling, right? People were at their living room tables helping their first grader and figuring out. We knew that. This feels like a more silent struggle right now. And it doesn't have to be a silent struggle. It's something we could talk about. And so I would say, bring this up in your conversations. Like, what are parents at work feeling? What are non-parents at work feeling? Is this even a demographic we need to dig into? And chances are the solution that you come up with will probably help everybody. But there's certainly a burden that certain parents are feeling in the workplace that we ought to look at. And hopefully this gave you something to look at and maybe talk about in your own workplace. John?
I was going to initially use the word empathy, but you pretty much covered that one. Just understanding whether you're a parent as a head of HR or a parent as a CEO, understanding how your workforce is feeling and confronting these challenges. But I'd say the second part of the answer is just a theme that we've kind of hammered on a few times here, is realizing that word parent is still an aggregate or generalized word for what really kind of learning what kind of parent your worker is, and I mean kind in terms of what life stage are they in, what are their circumstances like with their spouse, and what are their individualized life experiences, such that if you have the opportunity to almost kind of personalize the support you're able to give. So that's really going to be the only answer, because no two parents are alike, no two parent circumstances are alike. So doing that hard work of building that trust with your team, building that understanding of your team, and being as adaptive to their specific needs as you possibly can be. That's really where the hard work is, but that's where the payoff's going to come from.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, what I would add to that, I know, Allison, you're going to close us out here, is these are skills that we can build. Right? I think so many parents we talk to are like, I'm just figuring it out. Well, the same applies to leaders at work. We're just figuring it out. And so to the extent that companies see there's an opportunity to get better at this, build the skill, teach people, right? Train them, talk to them, figure it out. Because if we can do that at work, we'll likely be giving society a lift on something that's really important for us to do on a macro scale.
Amen.
Awesome. Thank you both. I'll end with putting two fine points. One, we're going to send you the slides in a thank you email, so be looking for those. And the second thing is just to say that you mentioned it, Simona, but one of the beauties of the Pulse of the U.S. Workforce is that if you wanted to dive into this data to look at your specific workforce, we have the ability to help companies do that. So it's one thing to have the national data set. It's another thing to be able to look across to really see what's going on for you specifically. If that's something that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to reach out to Idealis, and we can help you figure out how to